Welcome to our live discussion on the historical atom. I'm your host, Sean McDowell from Biola University. I'm here with two good friends of mine, two leading scientists who spent a lot of time thinking about the issue of the historical atom and the intersection of science and the intersection of faith. And so we're going to jump in and talk about this issue. And honestly, there's few issues today that are probably as divisive and interesting to people as the historical atom. So I can't wait to hear from two of our scholars. But before we get to that, also keep in mind, we will come to question and answer period at the end. We will open it up so you can ask a question for both of them, probably towards the end of our conversation. We will open that wide for your thoughts. But first, if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button because this channel is in partnership with Biola Apologetics. You can get all the interviews we have coming up with Stephen Meyer, with Os Guinness, and with some other experts. You will not want to miss this. My thanks to Biola Apologetics for sponsoring this. Well, let's dive in. Thanks for taking your Sunday night to join us to talk about this important issue. But I'm going to have each of you just briefly introduce yourselves in case possibly our audience is not familiar with who you are and your work. So, Dr. Josh Swamidass, go ahead and start.
Yeah, I'm Josh Swamidass. I'm the author of The Genealogical Adam and Eve, which is one of the books that some of us have been talking about.
We got it. We could see that.
I'm a scientist at Washington University in St. Louis. I don't work for any origins organization. I'm just a scientist that does work in computational biology and drug development and artificial intelligence and all that sort of stuff. But I got really interested in the questions of human origins, like a lot of Christians do, and really just wanted to see how I can make sense of it all together.
Excellent. Thank you. Fuzz.
Yeah, well, I'm Fazale Rana, and I am the Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe. This is the organization founded 30-some years ago now by Dr. Hugh Ross. I'm a biochemist by training and have always been long fascinated by the question of human origins. So over the years, I've taught myself physical anthropology and again, can't think of a more important issue when it comes to origins than the origin of humanity for a number of reasons. So good to be with you, Sean, and good to catch up with Josh again.
Well, my thanks for both of you coming on. I want our listeners to know that we're not pretending these are the only two positions that are out there. This is pretty obvious. There's other young Earth positions. There's other evolutionary positions, old Earth creationist positions. So tonight we're going to kind of compare and contrast and find common ground from two scientists who've both written and put forward different models how to reconcile the science and the theology. But I want to start by asking both of you a question and to see how you would respond to this. A well-known atheist biologist by the name of Jerry Coyne not long ago said, unlike the case of Jesus' virgin birth and resurrection, we can dismiss a physical Adam and Eve with near scientific certainty. That's a pretty bold claim that the science dismisses Adam and Eve. Fuzz, what would be your kind of knee-jerk reaction to such a strong claim like that?
Yeah, well, I would basically say that I don't think that there's actually anything within the scientific data that rules out the very real possibility that there could have been a historical Adam and Eve that gave rise to humanity, that existed at the headwaters of humanity. And on top of that, I think there's actually very good archaeological evidence for the notion of human exceptionalism, which is a scientific concept that I think dovetails with the image of God. So I would dispute Coyne's real strong claim.
Okay, that doesn't surprise me. But let me go to Dr. Swamidass. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, so that's a quote that I put on the first page of my book, right?
That's right.
And I came back to it in the last chapter. And those chapters are actually available online, so you can see precisely what I said there. But I think what's important here is that Jerry Coyne is actually wrong, but it wasn't just him that was wrong. It was also a lot of Christian scientists that were wrong, who were making some pretty strong claims as well. And while Fuzz has been saying that for a long time, most scientists didn't actually, they kind of agreed with Coyne. And I think what's really exciting now, which is really just over a very recent amount of time, I think that there's been a big shift in understanding to realize that actually Coyne really was wrong on that. And a lot of those other Christian scientists really were wrong, and actually science doesn't really tell us one way or another regarding Adam and Eve. And that, I think, is a very big shift, because it's no longer a minority position. I would just say that that's just really what the best science tells us.
We're going to get into some of the different ways that we've critiqued that, but it's important out front for us to agree that there's no good scientific basis to dismiss Adam and Eve from the get-go. Now let's start to unpack some of the evidence. Fuzz, let me start with you. Why does this issue even matter? Who cares about this couple that lived X thousands, or some would argue even millions of years ago? Why does that even matter for theology and or science?
Yeah, well, I mean, from my perspective, I don't think the historical Adam and Eve is a throwaway theological idea. I think it has, really broad reverberations for the Christian faith. First of all, because Scripture does speak about Adam and Eve, and from my reading, it looks as if they were, the sole progenitors of humanity, the first human beings. It becomes a question of biblical inerrancy. But on top of that, the idea of a historical Adam and Eve is intertwined with the idea of the image of God, which is the foundation for Christian ethics. It's the capacity that we have that allows us to enter into a relationship with God. It has bearing on things like the fall, original sin, even the atonement, and even doctrines like the doctrine of marriage, the doctrine of human sexuality. So this is a really critical idea when it comes to Christian theology.
That's a great answer. We have people from Texas, Pennsylvania, Melbourne, Australia watching this, which is really cool to have such a widespread audience. Josh, let me come to you. I know you would agree that the historical Adam matters theologically. Why do you think in the last 2 to 3, maybe 5 years, this issue has ramped up so much? Is it scientific evidence? Why now is there so much discussion about this topic?
Well, there's been discussion about it for a long time, but I think over the last few years, I found myself in a little bit of a whirlwind when I discovered that a lot of the science that had been put forward against Adam and Eve was really not on solid ground. And that certainly created a good amount of controversy, probably more than I bargained for. And that's actually what led to this book too. So I think part of why there's been so much discussion lately is that really there's been some pretty large shifts in our understanding as a result of that. There's a lot of things that people had said as recently. I mean, people have gone on to say these things, to be clear, but as recently as 2017, there was a book published that made very strong claims against Adam and Eve. And it just didn't really pan out, and it was thought to be really good consensus science, but there's just really big mistakes there. So I think that's probably why there's so much discussion. And to get to the question that you gave to Fuzz, which I think is important, is why this matters. And I want to answer that not from a Christian point of view, but from the point of view that values that even an atheist like Nathan Lentz, my friend, would take, or even my colleagues here at WashU would have. The reason why we should care about getting this straight is that this is a question arising in the public. And scientists at our best, we take questions seriously. We answer them with honesty and rigor. We don't really bring a polemic agenda to them. We really want to answer them fairly. And science, and that's why, even if you're not a Christian watching this, you should care, because frankly, if you look around, it really matters how scientists interact with the public, and we need to do it in a way that's fair and it's without unfair prejudice too.
Fuzz, you first wrote your book with Hugh Ross in 2005, Who is Adam? And then this week I read your 2015 update, where you believe the reason to believe model still holds, but you made some adjustments. Just since you wrote it in 2005, so the last 15 years, how have these discussions changed? So give some of us who have not been following this as closely as you have, give us a sense of how this has changed theologically, maybe scientifically, philosophically, so we understand where we're at today.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because, when Who is Adam was published in 2005, other than Marvin Lubino's book, which is From a Young Earth Perspective, Bones of Contention, there was really very little that had actually been written from the Christian community, or at least from evangelicals, on the question of human origins.
Interesting.
Who is Adam was one of the first books, and our approach there was try to to integrate in a serious way the findings from anthropology with what I would call a traditional biblical view of human origins. And so there wasn't a lot of people really looking at that question. And within by the time the 10-year update happened, it now had moved to a central issue among evangelicals. And I think in part that was due largely to the sequencing of the human genome, and then the genomes of the great apes and Neanderthals and Denisovans and creatures like that. And with the vast amount of genomics data, you could begin to probe the question of human origins in a way that nobody else, or that you couldn't do prior to that. And then there's also been some really significant advances happening in archaeology that I think give us a better picture of, when human exceptionalism emerged. And so these are, again, important advances that I think have bearing on the question of human origins that has really driven it to, I think, the forefront of interest among evangelicals. And there's no more exciting area in science, I think, than human origins.
That's a great answer. I love that both of you are excited about this. You're not afraid to ask these questions because of where your confidence is ultimately rooted. Now, before we get to some of the particulars about the different ways we can approach the historical Adam, all of us and those watching know that the assumptions we have when we come to this issue of how we do theology, how we do science, the assumptions we put into models deeply shape the numbers and outcome that we get. So I would love if each one of you could just briefly take and explain your understanding of kind of the intersection of science and faith and how you try to integrate those questions together. So what does your approach look like, Josh, as a scientist to do theology? How do you intersect or integrate those two?
Yeah, I guess I don't know if integration is maybe even the right mental picture of like, is it kind of blending together. What I would say is that the right relationship between science and theology is supposed to be dialogue. Science is a particular community of discourse. There's a particular way of engaging with evidence and thinking about it. And theology is the same way too. And you can kind of lump in exegesis or reading scripture, even though it's a little bit different, into that too. And really, to do really good exegesis or understand what scripture says, you don't go to a scientist to learn how to do that. You have to do that by the rules of good exegesis, right? It's the same way with good theology, and it's the same way with good science, that they have their own, internal consistent rules. But you don't want to kind of have them kind of just compartmentalized off into different places. We don't talk to each other. What's supposed to happen is just to be questions where there's constructive resistance that comes out, where we don't always have to agree, but we have to be engaged in asking one another. And my big concerns actually about this conversation has been that questions have not always been taken seriously. On the scientific side, the church has come with questions about Adam and Eve, and those questions haven't always been taken seriously. That really concerns me. And the other side too, I'm a scientist. I brought questions to theologians, and those haven't always been taken seriously either. We talk about how science doesn't rule out Adam and Eve, and that's true. But our best science does really seem to rule out some understandings of Adam and Eve. I think Fuzz would agree with that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so there's going to have to be some sort of exchange where we're really trying to figure out how do we make sense of everything together. And I think that's going to happen in the context of a larger conversation.
So you would use the term dialogue to describe between science and theology. Fuzz, you're part of Reasons to Believe. And by the way, there's a comment in the section that said it was Reasons to Believe that helped bring one of the viewers to faith. So keep up the good work. That's really encouraging. I know that's your heart and your heart as well, Josh, when it's all said and done. Talk about the model that Reasons to Believe takes, what some might call concordist between the theology and between the science, and how that plays itself out when it comes to historical Adam.
Yeah, and recently Hugh Ross has coined a term that he calls constructive integration, which is a type of concordism where you're looking for a correspondence between what we see in the biblical text and the record of nature. Recognizing that you have to interpret the record of nature and you have to interpret scripture, so what you're dealing is really with looking for a concordance in those interpretations, right? But with the idea behind constructive integration is you're going even one step further, where you're treating both scripture as a data set as well as the scientific record as a data set, and you're looking for a model that incorporates both sets of data into a coherent framework that provides the best explanation for everything that you see. And so, so because of that, we're willing to question certain biblical interpretations, and we're willing to question certain scientific interpretations as we work towards getting to that model.
That makes sense. One thing that might be helpful for our viewers, if each of you would just explain as a whole how you interpret the fossil record. So I know, Josh, you go with kind of the mainstream science, evolutionary understanding. Fuzz, you embrace an old Earth, but don't accept the evolutionary interpretation of the fossil record. If you could just explain for us your position on the fossil record and maybe why you hold it. And I realize we could spend the time talking about this, but that'll help us understand kind of your approach to the historical atom.
So I affirm evolutionary science, which means what I mean by that is very focused. I think that when I look at genomes, when I look at the fossil record, it looks like common descent to me. Now, that's from a scientific point of view. Taking God into account, I'm not saying that God wasn't involved in the process. Maybe he was engineering things at times. Maybe he was inspiring mutations. Maybe he was directly creating stuff. I don't know. But whatever he was doing, it looks like common descent. So that's not a statement against God's action and origins. It's actually more a statement of agnosticism in that regards, because science, I don't think, really adjudicates that claim. I think reasons to believe would actually be not that far off from that, except think that at times maybe there's reason to really start making an inference from the evidence that maybe God really did actually do things at times. I don't have a problem with saying that he did. I just can't really get to that point of saying that evidentially, like the positive evidence. Is that like a fair way of discriminating it?
You know what, let me jump in here and then have Fuzz come back and do his model. So just so viewers understand, you would say like how you understand just quickly Neanderthals and Denisovans when humans, I'm sorry, not the fossil record as a whole, but human evolution, just how you would make sense of that quickly.
Oh, yeah. I think it looks like we share common ancestors with the great apes, meaning chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas. I think there's an immense amount of evidence, especially genetic evidence, but also fossil record that really just seems to indicate common descent. It would have been very easy for God to create a world where that inference wouldn't be possible, where it just looked like our genomes were so bizarrely different from the great apes and that chimpanzees and gorillas didn't exist or whatever, that we would just conclude that we were separate from the rest of the world. But instead, it seems like we're continuous in some ways. That's what it looks like.
Okay, fair enough. Fuzz, how do you make sense or view the fossil record?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, we would agree that the fossil record is a real description of the natural history of the hominins. And so we, recognize that there was a diversity of hominin species over the last 6 or 7 million years. That the fossil record is a reliable, again, insight into the biology of these different hominins. But we would argue that these were creatures that God would have created that existed for a period of time and went extinct, that they would be biologically similar to human beings. And we would look at that similarity as reflecting common design as opposed to an evolutionary heritage or common descent. And so that's how we would look at that, the hominin fossil record. And specifically with Neanderthals, again, we would see the biological similarities between humans and Neanderthals as reflecting common design. But we would argue that there was significant behavioral differences between the hominins, including Neanderthals and modern humans, where that difference reflects the image of God. And our approach, real quickly, to the idea of common design versus common descent is influenced strongly by a biologist by the name of Sir Richard Owen, who predated Darwin and who argued that homologies, or these shared features, reflect an archetype that existed in the mind of the first cause. So we are employing that kind of an approach. And with regard to the fossil record, our views are shaped by Louis Agassiz, who was a progressive creationist, again, prior to Darwin. So anyway, in other words, we're not presenting an ad hoc approach to the fossil record or to the shared features, but rather we're drawing on a tradition that existed in biology prior to Darwin.
Okay, let's do this. Maybe let's have Fuzz, you could unpack what your kind of model is at RTB. We can talk about that a little bit. Josh, I want you to raise some questions, some points you agree with, maybe some ways you see it differently. Then come to your approach on the genealogical Adam and Eve and unpack that a little bit. So Fuzz, if you can, kind of briefly describe for us how you make sense of the theology and how scientifically historical Adam and Eve fit within an RTB model.
Yeah. Well, we would take the view that there was a historical Adam and Eve who were real individuals. They were the first human beings created by God uniquely in his image, and that they're the sole progenitors of humanity. And so for lack of a better description, we would take a genetic view of Adam and Eve. So it'd be a genetic Adam and Eve where the very first humans were genetically distinct from any other creature, and that all humanity comes from them and bears that genetic distinctive, that genetically we all identify as anatomically and behaviorally modern humans because we are all in Adam. So that would be our approach. And again, where we would look at Adam and Eve as being in effect de novo creations, though recognizing that there would again be those biological similarities with other hominins, in fact, with other life forms. And we actually think that there's a scriptural precedence for that because in Genesis 2, you see both Adam as well as the animals being made from the dust of the earth. And so we think that that's actually indicative that there's this shared biology that we would have with the other creatures. What distinguishes us again is that Adam received the breath of life and those other animals didn't. And so in that sense, we would say what really is the distinguishing factor is not so much our biology, but it's our behavioral capacity, which reflects the image of God.
So when you first published in 2005, Who is Adam? I believe you dated about 30 or 40,000 to 100,000 for Adam, and then pushed that back a little bit with recent findings. What window would you put for the historical Adam and Eve?
Yeah, right now I would say it's in the neighborhood of 100 to 150,000 years ago, kind of leaning closer to 150,000 years ago. And it's based on the fact that those are the approximate dates that you see for mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. That's also where you would see in the archaeological record the first appearance of symbolism, which I connect very closely to the image of God.
Okay. And
then also that's where you see the distinct anatomically modern human form appearing, so that there's like a convergence of scientific data. And I'm not convinced that you can actually date the creation of Adam and Eve from Scripture. I think Scripture really is agnostic. Though many people will use the genealogies, I don't think you can legitimately do that to date Adam and Eve.
Because the genealogies, as we compare them in different books, sometimes they skip over and are not meant to be taken in that fashion. Is that the position you would hold?
Yeah. In a nutshell, they're theological constructs. They're really not meant to be timekeeping devices.
So all other, whether it's Homo erectus or whether it's what people talk about Java man or Australopithecine, these are either humans that are direct descendants or hominids that are not human. Is that how you would see some of these other in the fossil record? Neanderthal, is that fair?
The way I would see the other hominins, like Neanderthals, Homo erectus, the Australopithecines, is that these were, again, creatures that were created by God that were, distinct, and they existed for a period of time and went extinct. To me, I think everybody that is within Adam is what we would call an anatomically and behaviorally modern human, or sometimes Homo sapiens sapiens. So that's the only category that I would say is human in the way that we would think of it in a biblical sense.
Okay, Josh, let me jump in here. I know you spent some time talking with Fuzz and Reasons to Believe, but tell me your impressions, your similarities, maybe where you see things different. I want to let you two engage in conversation.
Well, so I have, first of all, I want to say that the thing that's concerned me the most is that I think some of the statements by people aligned with mainstream science against the Reasons to Believe model have been really overblown. So I do think that there are some problems with the evidence that they have, but I do think that they're resolvable problems. And one of the things that actually impressed me the most about the 2015 book, Fuzz, is where you guys actually responded to evidence and adjusted and acknowledged that there was probably interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. That's really respectable. The fact that you're actually engaging with evidence and dealing with that. And it's not like it's something that you were happy about, right?
Yeah, right.
It raises some theological questions that you're working through, but I think that really cued me into something that there is a certain amount of integrity in what you're trying to do, and I think that I just do think that a lot of the statements against you have been really overblown. At the same time, I do think that there are some challenges you guys have with the evidence still, and I do think some refinements, including some that AJ Roberts has recently proposed, could really help towards getting you guys to a point where you have a model that's consistent with the evidence. I don't think it's a done deal yet, but I do see that there's a possibility ahead of you.
Let me jump in. I know that this isn't a debate, but tell us an example of where you see that evidence, and then I want to hear what Fuzz's response would be.
So one of the ways how statements have been really used wildly against them is people have said that there was 10,000 people or humans at that time, and there's no way we could all descend from Adam and Eve. That turns out to be just nonsense. For a whole ton of reasons, which I'm not even going to really get into now. Some of it's in my book that I'm writing now. Some of it's in a book I'm writing with William Lane Craig right now. But I do think that the evidence shows that, we couldn't probably fit. I mean, it really looks like there was at least, 20 or 30 people at that time as a bottleneck. But AJ had a clever way to work through this. Other people have proposed it too. Actually, Jerry Coyne is one of the first few places I saw this represented in literature. His idea is, well, maybe Adam or Eve, and AJ thinks that maybe it was Eve, was a genetic mosaic, that each of her eggs had a different genome. And if she was specially created, maybe God made her with the intrinsic capacity to give more diversity to her children and do that. And also down the line, there was a little bit of interbreeding with Neanderthals. Like, if that's the point where, maybe that actually resolves some or many of the genetic challenges. That's one set of challenges that I think could be resolvable as they start working that out. And, we're trying to help them out with that too. The other way,
hey, let me jump in before you do the second one. Fuzz, what are your thoughts on that? Give me a comment, then I'm going to jump back to Josh for his other critique or analysis.
Well, in January, Reasons to Believe in Peaceful Science, which is Josh's organization, held a joint workshop where we began to explore, some of the strengths, some of the deficiencies in our approach, as well as getting a chance to hear in detail Josh's idea of the genealogical Adam, with the eye towards, is this something that we can incorporate or make use of within the RTB model? And so what I appreciate is that we're moving towards a spirit of disagreement, yet collaboration in the midst of that disagreement. And I'm increasingly recognizing that sometimes when it comes to scientific apologetics, people end up staking their ground and establishing their territory, and they're not really willing to move outside of that territory. And it becomes a question of trying to demonstrate that you're right versus trying to get it right. To quote one of my favorite sports talk personalities, Colin Cowherd. But
he's one of my favorites too. Just for the record.
But anyway, and so to me, I think we're at a juncture where there's so much at stake with the question of the historical Adam that we've got to set aside this idea of being concerned if we're right and really working together to try to come up with viable models, not maybe a single model, but viable models that we can present that with credibility to the scientific community. So I appreciate actually Josh's critique and pointing out where he feels like there's deficiency. And so I'm taking it very seriously. And AJ's article, as Josh is mentioning, of the Mosaic Eve is one response to that. So I appreciate Josh's friendly critique, and the hope is that, again, we can actually develop and are developing a friendship with an eye towards how do we really work together for the sake of the gospel in this very important issue. And so I appreciate Josh's points very much, and he's even pushed me hard on the question of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam, and I do think that they were real individuals, but I'm really beginning to back away from the claim that maybe these were the biblical Adam and Eve, and so I don't think that necessarily undermines our model, but it just helps us to develop a stronger sense of, I think, credibility when we're engaging non-believers on this issue.
So let me jump in real fast, and then I want to come back to your second point, Josh. Don't forget it. Why would you not think mitochondrial Adam and I totally butchered it, and Eve, that is not the biblical Adam and Eve? Why would you come to that conclusion for lay people?
Well, I mean, it's very clear that you can trace, let's say, use mitochondrial DNA as an example. You can trace the origin of every mitochondrial DNA variant that you see in the human genome back to a single ancestral sequence. And there are people that have argued, not just Christians, but non-Christians as well, that this very well could have been a single female individual. But as Josh has helped me to appreciate in finer detail, you could actually still have a human history prior to mitochondrial Eve.
Okay.
And so you can go back to a single female individual, but she may not have been the first human. Unlikely that she was the first human, but it still doesn't mean that there couldn't have been a genetic Eve or a genetic Adam. So it's just that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes
it's
sense.
Like Adam, like in like a genetic sole progenitorship model where there's no interbreeding with Adam's lineage and others. Mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam wouldn't probably be Adam and Eve. It'd be probably one of their descendants. That's the most likely thing. They basically put like a lower limit, like the most recent time.
Okay.
But it could be any time before that. And so this is actually gets to an interesting point. I think our instinct has been, and it's not picking on Fuzz at all, because honestly, a lot of people thought this, has been that, science can just be this really bright spotlight that will tell you exactly what happened in the past. And it's actually far more open-ended than that. I mean, I think there's just a lot of things that could be consistent with the evidence when you get into the past. And so that makes it really hard to rule out stuff.
Okay.
And also makes it hard at times to even discriminate between different theories, too.
Fair enough. So it's not like go get a DNA, see if somebody's fingerprint was on a gun, and hence maybe the person who committed the crime. As you get back in history, that fingerprint fades and sometimes is not even present, genetically speaking. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I would tell you that I was surprised by a lot of this too as I studied it. I mean, I'm a biologist, and a lot of biologists that I've talked to have been surprised too to learn about crazy things like genetic ghosts. It turns out the majority of our ancestors don't even pass us any DNA. Just go back 300 years or so, the majority of your ancestors don't give you any DNA. Like, that's not intuitive. That's something you have to kind of sit down and think through to work out, right? And it just means that when we look at things from a genetic point of view, there's just this gigantic blind spot. And to be clear, we do learn a lot of stuff about our past through DNA, but it doesn't tell us everything. And if we expect it to, we're going to just end up really confused.
Let's go to your second question you had for the RTB model.
Well, so it's probably a two-parter, because it really comes down to, like, honestly, the two books that I'm writing. One, this one that I just published, The Genealogical Economy, and the other one I'm writing with Bill Craig. It really has to do with what is the relationship between Adam and Eve in the image of God and the fossil record. So in a lot of ways, Bill Craig takes a view that's very similar to Reasons to Believe, except for two differences. One difference is that he has no problem with Adam and Eve sharing common ancestors. Adam and Eve didn't actually have to be de novo created. And then second, he just thinks that the evidence for the humanness of Neanderthals is overwhelming, and for Denisovans, and so he thinks Adam and Eve are farther back in history.
Okay.
And so he's pressing them pretty hard on that. And I'll tell you, from my outside perspective in some ways, just playing rough a little bit, I think that there's actually legitimacy to both sides on this.
Okay.
I think that there's scientists that disagree on that question, because I don't think that the evidence really adjudicates. But that's one challenge. But then on the other challenge, which is related to this, is why is it that we think that human exceptionalism has to arise with Adam and Eve? I'm not really convinced that you can make a strong case for that scripturally. Now, Bill Craig will disagree with me on that. Fuzz will disagree with me on that too. But I think that there's this possibility that I'm really exploring in the genealogical Adam and Eve, the idea of the image of God as Fuzz thinks about it, that image of God arises long before Adam and Eve.
Okay.
And so I think really those are the two. I think those are probably the two big questions that arise back to Fuzz. Now, I don't think any of these things are a deal breaker necessarily for him. I think those are just going to be the things that unsettle the conversation. So it'll probably never be that everyone will settle down on any one answer because of that.
So Fuzz, let me ask one more on your model, then we'll come to Josh's, then we'll open up for questions. I did hear Craig argue that he thinks it's pretty much a solid shut case that Neanderthals were human biologically, relationally like us. You have a whole chapter in your book critiquing that view. Why do you hold that view? And what if it turned out that this was another area RTB had to change? What would that do to your model if it turns out you were wrong about Neanderthals?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is true that you can find scientific claims in the literature arguing that Neanderthals had cognitive capacities similar to us, and for me, I view the image of God as a resemblance view, where I think the image of God refers to certain attributes that human beings uniquely possess, and to me, the idea of human exceptionalism, specifically centering around our capacity for symbolism, is really, I think, a scientific descriptor of the image of God. I think the image of God is intertwined with, the idea of our symbolic capacity. And so I think you can make a really strong argument that human beings uniquely possess symbolic capabilities that Neanderthals lack symbolism. But Bill Craig and I actually agree on how to understand the image of God, and agree that the archaeological record is the way to probe when does the image of God appear and who has it. But then where we disagree really is what is the criteria that you're using when you evaluate the archaeological evidence for the image of God. I would argue it's symbolism, and as I understand it, Bill Craig is arguing for evidence for rationality. And as I've thought about Bill Craig's point, and it took me a long time to think about this. It wasn't just like, oh, here's where I think Bill Craig is going wrong. And I think it's fairly unequivocal to say this is evidence for symbolism in the archaeological record. I think when you talk about evidence for rationality, that's much more ambiguous. And so I think what he's interpreting as evidence for rationality, it isn't necessarily
See, this is what I love. So first of all, I want to say is that there's a videotape of Fuzz and Bill Craig at our workshop trying to hash this out. You got to go watch it.
Good.
You guys got to put it online, by the way, Fuzz. It's like a really remarkable thing. And I got to tell you, as a person who has nothing in stake in that conversation, it was still beautiful to watch, because what you see is, two Christian leaders trying to really grapple and try and really figure out what it means to be human. And there's something deeply satisfying about that. And I think that that's why this is an important, interesting conversation. It brings us to this question. And I'll tell you, this is a grand question. And I don't think we should expect simple answers. And, it's the grand question that unsettles all the questions. And I think there's a real opportunity for the church to do right now. It's really intended to our conversation that might even include, and probably should even include, non-Christians as well. Or we're starting to look at this big question of how humans arise, and to kind of figure it out and work through it together. We all care about that question, right? And so, I think that's actually the really interesting, exciting thing about that instability and uncertainty between Bill Craig and Fuzz, that I think is just really beautiful to see.
Well, and to be fair, there are anthropologists who are non-believers who would agree with Bill Craig, and there's anthropologists who would, I think, agree with me. And so this is what makes this, as Josh says, fun. If I could offer an editorial comment, so often when we come to these conversations, we are so uptight because there is a lot at stake here. And I think that really doesn't serve us well. I think what we need to do is set aside the fear and just as Josh is saying, revel in the fact that this is a really fun, challenging problem that helps us, I think, draw closer to God as we wrestle through this issue. And instead of adopting, again, combative postures towards one another, we should actually appreciate what each other is bringing to the table is really a very valuable perspective that may help us as we work as a community get where we've got robust explanations that we can take to a non-believer and say, look, this idea of the biblical view of human nature and human origins has credibility to it, and therefore the gospel should be taken seriously.
Well, one of the things I appreciate most about RTB is that you do have an evangelistic heart, and you make that clear, but you put out a testable model. And then when it's shown to be false, you're willing to adjust it in terms of where the evidence goes. I think that's commendable. Fuzz, I'm going to have you move about 3 inches to your left so we can center you a little bit. There we go. Beautiful. As we shift to Josh, you put forward in your book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve. You gave Bill Craig and myself a chance to endorse it. And you and I differ over this, the question of evolution significantly. But I loved your approach in this book. I think it's unique. I think it's fresh. I think it's provocative. As simply as you can, present to our audience what this model looks like. And then I want to hear questions that Fuzz might have for you.
Yeah, what I'd say is that, well, thank you, by the way, Sean. I'm also really curious exactly where you disagree with me. Sometimes it's hard to find disagreements. Honestly, with Fuzz, I think there's this thing that happens as we get to know each other where like the disagreements kind of start to just seem small. At a certain point, you forget that they're even there. Anyways, what I'd say is I want to start with my motivation on it first and really what my goal is and then what the model is.
Great.
So my goal is to make space for differences. It's a civic practice of science. And so I'm not trying to tell anyone that they're wrong, per se. Like the goal of this book isn't to convince reasons to believe that they're wrong. But to really just say, even for the people who really don't think evolution is true, I'm just saying, hey, well, enter a thought experiment with me. And let's just see if we can understand each other through that. And so with that, my question is not, do you think that this model is true? But if this was true, would it really be a problem? Could this be like a second choice? Could this be something that's acceptable in your camp? That's actually how I want the reasons to believe. Not saying, will you change your model to adopt mine? Let's say you have your model, I'll help you with yours. But would this be acceptable for someone in your camp to hold? And so it's a very low bar. And I just want to be very clear up front. I'm not trying to convince everyone that I'm correct. I'm just trying to say, could this be acceptable too?
Okay.
So what's the crazy idea? My crazy idea is that given what we know from science, and this is endorsed by Nathan Lentz, who's an atheist biologist, Alan Templeton, who's a Jewish leading population geneticist, and several other secular scientists have either directly endorsed the book on the back of the book or who have written reviews and so on and so forth saying that the science here is good, consistent with the best evidence that Adam and Eve could have been de novo created out of the dust of a rib as recently as 6,000 years ago. And by 81, everyone across the globe would be their descendants. And so before Jesus even begins his ministry, everyone across the globe would be descendants of Adam and Eve. And so the only way that evolutionary science seems to press on even the most literal account of Genesis you can imagine is by suggesting that there was people outside the garden that their lineage eventually interbred with. So I think that's the crazy idea. And it turns out that there isn't strong evidence against that. That's actually entirely consistent with what we know from science. And it does raise interesting theological questions, but really nothing that seems to be a deal breaker.
So let me ask you this. Make a distinction what you mean by the genealogical Adam as opposed to the genetic Adam.
So the genetic Adam is also our genealogical Adam and Eve. So we descend genetically and genealogically from Fuzz's Adam and Eve, right? Mm-hmm. The difference is I'm suggesting that maybe it's okay if they're not our genetic ancestors, but they're just our genealogical ancestors. What if they're one of those people that are genealogical or genetic ghosts in our past that we genealogically descend from, but as DNA was diluting down from every generation with all that interbreeding, most of us just didn't get any of their DNA, and it just doesn't matter because that's not what made them special. What made them special was something else that God was doing with them. And so that's a surprising thought for a lot of people because generally people have collapsed those two things together. But when you look at Scripture doesn't talk about DNA. It just doesn't mention a double helix. It talks about ancestors begetting, descendants, like fathers and sons and daughters and mothers. That's the ancient way how people thought about ancestry. They didn't think about DNA. And so when we kind of read scripture for what it's saying, you don't come away with certainty that we're the genetic descendants of Adam and Eve, but you really are going to have a hard time with Orthodox Christianity if you're going to deny that they were genealogical ancestors of us. But we find out scientifically, though, is that if they existed, most likely there are genealogical descendants anyways. So it's not actually, this is in conflict with science.
So,
does that make sense?
Yeah, so genealogy is, we look, say, the beginning of Matthew and Luke, or we look in early chapters in Genesis. It's really your ancestors that you relate to, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents. It's not a genetic link. It's anybody that you trace back through history to. That's what you mean by genealogical ancestor, right?
Yeah, and we find out these people are all over the place. There's a lot of people from everyone descends, right? But the key thing is that there could have been a couple in the Middle East that had a special theological purpose that all of us today descend from now. And so what that does is allows us to adopt this old ancient definition of human that is in the Genesis tradition of defining human as Adam and Eve and their descendants. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't humanness or human exceptionality or the image of God outside the garden. It's just saying humans, as Scripture defines it, as Adam and Eve and their descendants. And it turns out that actually works if it extends to everyone across the globe at the time of 81. And so you could just take that very traditional understanding of human, and it works just fine. Now, the big question you have now is what's going on outside the garden? And I think that that is a bit of a surprise for theology, but people have been also wondering about that for a long time. I'm certainly not the first person to suggest that there was people out there. And it was considered for a long time and rejected as false if that meant that there was people alive today that don't descend from Adam and Eve. That wouldn't be good, because that would mean that there's people alive today that aren't connected to the story of Scripture, and that would be a problem, right? Mm-hmm. But I show that's not actually what's happening, that actually everyone alive today would be connected to the story of Scripture. So we're just talking about the very, very distant past. And so this is no more challenging to theology, I believe, than if we ever found intelligent aliens on another planet. I mean, it would be certainly surprising. Scripture doesn't tell us that there's people on other planets. If God did that, we'd know that God created them too, right? If we found them. And they would raise lots of interesting questions about how God relates to them. But it's not like that would somehow disprove our understanding of Scripture. It would just mean that there's like a larger story that we're part of. And so I think that's all that we're really facing with this.
I see some good questions coming in. We will come to your questions. I see Travis and Mark. Give me just a little bit of time. We will come to those. These are excellent. So if I understand, you believe there can be within 6,000 years ago, de novo creation of Adam and Eve in a garden, and they are the genealogical ancestors of everybody who's alive. But the way they do this is they leave the garden, interbreed with other people that are out there, human or not, that got their...
Well, they would be human in the way how you would think about it scientifically, or the way how...
biologically.
Talking about. They'd have the image of God in that sense, but they're just not the humans to which Scripture is referring. So they're not the people who are connected to the story of Scripture in the way how Adam and Eve's descendants are. So it's a very technical definition. We don't have a problem of bestiality or something like that. These are God intended for them to interbreed too. So it avoids that theological objection because they're fully human people. They're just not the humans that Scripture's talking about. One way how some theologians have taken this is to call them covenantal humans. To say, in the same way, I can say that I'm married to my wife and my wife is the only woman in my world. That's true. That doesn't mean that somehow denigrate the other women out there in the world. It just means they're not in that relational scope. But there's other ways to think about it too, and I'm just giving one to make sense of it and inviting other theologians to make sense of it too.
Okay, so just so I understand our listeners, central to this model, which you're putting forth for discussion as a possibility, is that there are people outside of the garden who developed through an evolutionary process. You would say God guided in some fashion. As they interbred, all of us would trace back genealogically to that couple first created de novo, but went outside the garden and interbreed with these people. So everybody alive is a genealogical ancestor of Adam and Eve in that sense. Is that correct? Yeah,
we'd be ancestors of both sides. And like I said, I'm not inventing anything in the interpretation here. Okay. A lot of this just is in historical Christianity. So there's been a big debate in theology about how to look at Genesis 1 in relationship to Genesis 2. Some people think that those have got to be recapitulative accounts. Some of them, they've got to be sequential. But the key thing is that they are different accounts. And Genesis 1, even if you take it as a recapitulatory, really seems to be a broader archetypal account. And Genesis 2 really seems to be much more focused on what's happening in the garden. And that leaves space for this idea that God created all these people in God's image outside in the garden. And then he created Adam and Eve with a special purpose that they screwed up. They screwed up royally, right?
Fuzz, let me come to you for your questions, but I want to frame it a certain way because I imagine some of your friends who are scientists, maybe not believers, think you're maybe compromising in some fashion, possibly to make room for historical Adam. On the other side, there's probably some people who go, well, do I want to go this far evolutionarily thinking to embrace this model? So Fuzz, I'm curious. Do you look at this and go, you know what? If we can have historical Adam and evolutionary scientists, we just remove one objection out of the way. This is an awesome welcome at the table option. Or do you kind of pause and go, well, people outside the garden and everything that comes with this raises concerns for you?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll say that I like you, Sean, I think that what Josh has done is really something that's, fresh. It's I think I find nothing to critique Josh's ideas scientifically. I think, it really represents a bona fide, distinct approach to the question of the historical Adam that I think gives us another viable model when we're approaching non-believers, or even within the church. Hey, here's another way in which you can have an evolutionary origin of humanity and still retain a historical Adam and Eve. So, I from a scientific perspective, I think what Josh has done here is really, really very fine, really, really very good. To me, where I have questions, I wouldn't say they're really, really critiques, but where I have questions or where I have some hesitation is with what's happening outside the garden.
Okay.
Because you have these two individuals that now bear God's image, but from my perspective, again, where I'm adopting a resemblance view for the image of God, well, everybody else that would have been around at that time likewise would be indistinguishable biologically and behaviorally from Adam and Eve. And so how do you handle the notion of the image of God? Okay. It would be conceivable at certain points in history where people that were alive would not be, some of those would not be in Adam. So those are questions that I have that I find difficult to reconcile. So to me, I prefer our approach at Reasons to Believe currently, just simply because I think it's cleaner theologically and cleaner biblically, though I would agree that Josh's approach is probably much more mainstream, scientifically speaking, than the approach that we're adopting. So that would, the weakness of our approach would be it's not a scientific mainstream approach. Though I don't think it's a scientific.
But I can help you with that. We'll make your approach more mainstream. But Fuzz, though, like I was saying, that the people outside the garden could be in the image of God. So you could just say the image of God arises much more ancient in history. And so those people have dignity and rights. And it's just that there's something different that's special about Adam and Eve. So,
yeah, well, and I very much appreciate the point, and I really appreciate how you've tapped into historical theology, Josh, to defend the theological implications of your ideas. But to me, when I look at Genesis 5, that to me is the passage that I struggle with most in light of your idea, simply because there it's talking about Adam and Eve being kind of the Adam being the father, the patriarch for the genealogy that goes from Adam to Noah. And there's a parenthetical statement where it says that Adam was made in the image of God. So there you see that strong connection, I think, between Genesis 2 and Genesis 1, where you see Adam being created, and so in the Genesis 5 genealogy, you really are convolving Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And so the implications of that, I think, is that Adam was the first person to have the image of God, and everybody, from Adam's descent bears God's image. So that's where I struggle.
Your view is really similar to Bill Craig, and trust me, I mean, I'm friends with Bill Craig now, which is a little weird for me because he's far more famous than I am. But as a writer of this book, man, we just can't help but argue about that every now and then. And like, he's very convinced that that's the case. I just don't see it yet, but that's okay. Yeah. I think he ends up, I think in his more lucid moments, he's always very lucid, to be clear. He'll say it's not actually precisely about Scripture; it's more about his philosophical point of view, and he thinks that that's important, and I think that is an important way of knowing too. And I mean, you guys are drawing on a real tradition in the church too, which is really held that the image of God begins with Adam and Eve. I'm just not sure we're bound to it, but I think the more interesting thing. Fuzz, is I was truly impressed by the reception you guys gave me in January, because I was asking that question, not that you change over to my point of view, right? But can this view be acceptable within your camp? And where did you guys come to?
Well, we're still discussing it, and so we oftentimes have ongoing conversations about it, and I think that's the value of what you brought to the table, Josh, is that you're forcing everybody to think about this question a little bit differently. And so, I very much appreciate that, A. And B, I think it is a model that you've presented where you can have a historical Adam and Eve and embrace an evolutionary perspective. Some of my reticence to embrace evolution has to do with other concerns I have about.
Yeah, but I would say that it's not like an all or none proposition. So, for example, I say 6,000 years ago, but the evidence doesn't lock you into 6,000 years ago. It could have been 10,000 years ago. 50,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago. Any of those dates work. And also, I say that the people outside the garden were created by a providentially governed process of common descent. But if one was to believe that God created them specially outside, you could do that. I mean, that'll raise a whole set of other questions that if you can handle those head on, I'm not going to stand in your way. But it's not like this is like you got to take or leave the whole thing as one big package. I'm really just trying to serve the church by showing what's possible. I think what we're going to see over time actually is a gigantic diversity of views that maybe has this at one continuum as maybe the most literalistic way of taking it. That's consistent with science, but that's going to probably stretch, kind of pick up something like the reasons to believe model along the way, and then kind of end with, at the other bookend of it, William Lane Craig, with probably the most mythological way you could possibly take it. and I think that that's okay.
Yeah.
Fuzz, let me ask you this, and then we'll go to some questions here. I'm going to start with one from Travis, which is great. Is that your main concern, is that Genesis seems to be saying however old Adam is, Adam and Eve are the first human beings in any sense, and there wouldn't be any outside the garden? That's your central concern? Do you have other ones outside that beyond your disagreement with evolution, or is that really the heart of it?
That probably is the central concern, and I would say it's giving me hesitancy more so than it's a concern, because I think Josh has reasonably wrestled with the theological implications of that. So I very much appreciate what Josh has done in his book, and I just still am not persuaded theologically that there were people outside the garden, but that's my hesitancy. Yeah.
So let me ask the two of you this. Last one, Travis, I'm coming to a question. Where do you think this discussion is going in the next 5 to 10 years? Can we even guess or have a sense of where it's going, or are things moving so fast that we don't even know? Go ahead, Josh. Do you have any sense of where the next scientific or theological breakthroughs may be?
On human origins, I think that we're learning more about our sister species now than ever before, like Neanderthals and Denisovans. I mean, I think it's a really amazing place to continue watching closely. I do think that it's very uncertain right now what the conversation is going to look like in the church, because everything's kind of been upended in the last couple of years. Like a lot of the settled positions are really having to kind of be reworked. BioLogos recently acknowledged that they've really made some large errors on the science, and they haven't even really acknowledged all of the errors yet. I mean, so how does that play out over the next couple of years? Reasons to Believe is really poised to put together a model that does have scientific plausibility and that could be more mainstream. Are they going to seize that and really kind of cross that finish line? I hope they do, to be clear. Even if it's not my view, I think I just want to see more and more Christians in the public square not saying stupid stuff about science and really just doing it in a way that non-Christians understand and it makes sense and it makes them curious and interested. And I think that could be the exciting, positive thing. But I think it's hard to predict right now because, like I'm saying, a lot of it is just really being reworked. It's been interesting looking at the reviews for my book, where it's like the first pass reviews are very interesting, and they're kind of all over the map in a lot of ways. I think some people it's so surprising, I think, for some people, the idea of like a 6,000-year-old atom, de novo created, being consistent with evidence, that I think it's been hard for some people to process and make sense of it. So it's going to take probably a little time for people to chew on that and digest it, too. I don't know. What do you think will happen, Fuzz?
Gosh, I mean, if there's anything that it's going to be really hard to predict, that's going to be one of those things. But, I'm actually encouraged because I'm beginning to see more and more Christians taking a really very serious interest in this question, both from a scientific and biblical perspective, and really we're seeing kind of an emergence of a number of different models. Even, the Discovery Institute is beginning to speak on the question of human origins in some interesting ways, and we did this workshop at Reasons to Believe in January, and we plan on doing more in the future. And I was really encouraged because there were a number of differing perspectives that were there at the table, but it was such a fun, invigorating time where we were really, I think, discussing in an open and forthright way, our differing perspectives. But it didn't feel like there was this. It was a sense of collegiality, which I was really encouraged by, and I really hope that what comes out of this at the end of the day is really a collection of models, a range of models, all each with strengths and weaknesses that really allow us to present options both in the church and outside the church on this question. And I think the models that are going to emerge are going to be models that are going to be highly credible models. Theologically as well as scientifically. At least that's where I hope we wind up.
Yeah, I agree. I think also what they're going to do is that range of plausible scientific models is going to move it from being about the threat of science to really placing this into a different sort of question about what really is important. What really is important right now, and to think carefully about this. And I think it's okay for Christians to come to different points of views. But even this question about, is it really important to deny any sort of image of God outside the garden? That's like one of the questions that I'm bringing to the table.
Well, that's a fascinating
even if Fuzz comes to a different conclusion than me on that, I actually think the discomfort is part of the fun and the good of it. Because it's not actually like there's something at threat here. This is like the good question, right? This is like the good conversation. This is the grand conversation.
Well, let me jump in, Fuzz. This question is for you from Travis Lee. And by the way, we've got people from India watching, which is really neat as well. He says this. He says, Dr. Rana, would RTB ever consider a day-age view with a two-population model? Namely, that there were Adam and Eve, but people outside the garden. Would RTB be open to that and potentially embrace it?
I would say that we would be open to it. I can't predict if we would embrace something like that or not. But yeah, I mean, we continually have conversations internally. What is really the best way to understand Genesis 1? And so even though we strongly are a day-age organization, and that approach is largely largely shaped by Hugh, and most of us at RTB would agree, with Hugh, considerably on that perspective of Genesis 1. We do have ongoing internal conversations all the time. Some people that are on our staff actually favor an analogical day view.
Okay.
And so we have discussions about what's the right way to think about Genesis 1 and what's the right way to think about the relationship between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. So I would say, yes, we're open. I can't predict that we would necessarily change, but we would be open to that possibility.
Okay, that's very interesting to hear. Let me ask this question. I'll have both of you can comment on this. It said, did the Great Flood also remove people outside of the line of Adam? So we would not expect to see the other humans present today. How does the flood play into this?
So this is actually a really important point, and I touch on it in the book. You'd have to read the footnotes and read closely because I don't really focus on it. But the word human doesn't actually appear in Genesis. When you read mankind in Genesis 1 or humankind, depending on your translation, the word being used there is Adam. It's literally the word Adam. So some people have actually gone so far as to say that that's evidence that Adam wasn't a real person because, would you think of a man named human as really a person or as an archetype, right? So what's going on with that? Well, I don't think that you can really. I don't think that argument that he's not a real person really works. And the reason why is because, well, I can get into that later. I'm going a little bit on a sidetrack, but I'll tell you that the key point here is that it doesn't actually talk about humans in the way we think about humans. It's a bit of anachronism. That's us taking a very modern concept of what actually human is and kind of transplanting that into Scripture. It's just talking about Adams. It's talking about the rise of Adams. And then if you actually look at the text of concerning the flood, it's clear that it's talking about the atoms in the arets, the atoms in that area. It's not talking about humans across the globe. They didn't even have a concept of globe at that time. So it would be completely bizarre to think that they're saying that humans across the globe were all killed. What it says instead is that the descendants of Adam in this area were destroyed. And so when you take it from, if a literal reading of Genesis is important, that's what it's literally saying. It can't literally be talking about a globe. So I think we just need to kind of accept that that's all it's saying. And it turns out that there's actually good evidence that there was a gigantic flood that killed a lot of people. Adam and Eve in this case have to be a little bit farther back in history, maybe 10,000 years ago. But there's the Persian Gulf oasis, which actually Fuzz and those are reasons to believe had noticed a long time ago, where the Persian Gulf actually used to be the gigantic oasis with 4 rivers converging. It looks exactly like what's described in Genesis as the garden. And so that's probably one of the strongest reasons to think about Adam and Eve, I think, not being necessarily at 6,000 years ago, but just a little bit farther back in time, like maybe 10 or 12,000 years ago. And if you do that, then this idea of the flood could have been very literal in terms of God destroying and removing people from the area of the garden. But it would have been Adam, not humans across the globe, but Adam. And that's what the literal teaching of Genesis could be, but it can't literally be humans across the globe.
Fuzz, go ahead. Any thoughts on how the flood affects the historical Adam?
Yeah, our view would be that, again, the flood was a real event, that it was a local event, and that we would see the flood as actually being the trigger for human migrations around the world. So that's how we would see the flood account affecting the question of human origins. It's essentially triggering the migration of humanity around the world. That's
would that have been like 150,000 years ago, or would it have been?
Well, I think this is one place where internally we are still working through is exactly when would you place the time of the flood event, because if you have an origin of humanity approximately 125,000 years ago, and the migrations of humanity around the world arguably begin about 60,000 years ago, you're going to have to place the flood event, in that window of time, right? And so we're still working that through, to be clear. But I do think that you see migration patterns in a broad sense from the scientific data that seems to me to be consistent with what you see in Scripture about the migration of humanity. So I see a harmony there in the biblical account and in the scientific record.
Josh, here's a question for you that it says, in what way would those humans outside the garden have been morally accountable to God?
So that's a really great question. What I would say the first thing to remember is that Scripture doesn't really tell us about them. And so I think that there is an uncertainty that arises there. So Scripture doesn't tell us, but we do know something about who God is and his character and how he's made us. So we can start to make inferences, and we should judge them by how coherent they are. So we're going to be going beyond Scripture as we think about them. And that's why we don't have to worry about contradicting Scripture. And also we're speculating here. So, I'm going to speculate, but maybe I'm wrong. And I would say that, other theologians are coming forward with their own speculations, and I think that that's great too. What I would say is that I think that there's very good evidence that they had a sense of moral right and wrong. So the whole idea of, in Romans 1, where it talks about how God made himself known to people from the beginning of time, I think that probably applies to them too. I think that they had a sense of moral law, but they didn't have the same opportunity or ability to be in direct relationship with God that Adam and Eve would have been. So thinking about it covenantally does help how I think about it. So were they responsible or not? Well, I would say that they were certainly responsible enough not to deserve anything from God. So I think God had a choice in how he handled them. Maybe he allowed them to just pass into oblivion. Maybe, and they had a good life here on earth. They didn't deserve anything more from him, and then they died, and that was that. Or maybe it was a different dispensation. So there's this long history in the church of dispensationalism, and I don't mean that in like this caustic, rigid sense, but this idea of different, like before Jesus came, it doesn't mean that no one went to heaven. There was a different dispensation of grace. The grace still came through Jesus, but Jesus made himself known and available to people in a different way in the time of the Jewish nation, and then there was a different time before that. And so we can just think about what was the era or the dispensation before Adam and Eve, when God made himself available to some people in some way that we don't fully understand. We don't have to understand. So I think both ways are possible. I think it's a really interesting question to think through what makes the most sense, and I'm really curious to find out when we get to heaven.
It sounds like the question is similar to if we found people on other planets, theologically, how they'd be related to us in the death of Jesus. Do you see that question, that being similar?
Yeah, I would say we'd see the exact same contemplation rise in a couple places. One is exactly right. I don't think the question of people in the image of God before Adam is any more challenging than the idea of rational souls on another planet.
Okay.
It would be equally confusing to figure out, but it wouldn't be a threat. But then the other place where it comes out, I would say, is what happened about 500 years ago when they discovered the New World. From their point of view, actually, the church had basically settled on the notion that maybe the Earth is a globe, but there's no one on the other side of the planet, because they certainly wouldn't descend from Adam and Eve. And then when they discovered the New World and found there was people there, that's when a whole bunch of debate happened. And the church basically said, you can say whatever the heck you want, but we'd rather move Adam and Eve really, really, really far in the past so we can be certain that those people over there descended from Adam and Eve, than you say they don't descend from Adam and Eve. So that's where the doctrine of monogenesis gets really clearly formulated in the Catholic Church. And that becomes like really one of like the demands of orthodoxies, that we all descend from Adam and Eve. So, but that arose then, there's the idea of like another continent. As being a place where it raised all those questions. And then what really raised the question for a lot of people is this idea of, okay, so here, there's all these Native Americans over there, and this is now like, the 1500s or the 1600s or whatever. For over 1,000 years, Jesus has died and risen again, and they don't know about it. So what happened to all of them? Did they all go to hell? Did they all, like, what happened there? That's a big theological question that the church wrestled with. And when it gets right down to it, we don't know precisely, because we do know that God sometimes made himself available outside his normal ways, right? So I don't know if we can know for sure. And of course, there's going to be people debate. Some people will say absolutely not. Some people would say that God in his foreknowledge knew that they wouldn't respond to the gospel. You can have all those sorts of questions and things thrown out there. But all of that contemplation that happened about those people applies equally well to think about all the people before Adam and Eve.
Okay.
It's the same sort of question. There isn't like a qualitative difference between that type of contemplation. And I'd say what's particularly notable about the Christian faith is that we are a faith that has had eras. So when you look at Paul in Romans, he's grappling with the transition of an era, the era before Christ to the era after Christ, the era of only Jews to now the era of Gentiles. And so his theology is going through major revisions, actually. And it's weird because it's deeply consistent with where he came from, but it's also deeply surprising. It only makes sense in light of who Jesus was and that this man rose from the dead and who was a light to the Gentiles. And it's beautiful, right? And that's kind of at the core central kernel of what our faith is that transition between eras. And so with that in mind, it's hard to be really scared about these questions about Adam and Eve. They just seem like this grand invitation to theology. Ken Keathley, who's deeply connected into Reasons to Believe, I like how he talks about it. He thinks that this question about Adam and Eve approaches the significance of that sort of era change that we get to wrestle now. He tells me whenever I talk to him, he's like, you know what, 100 years from now, people are going to be looking back to what we're saying right now about these questions of Adam and Eve, and it's going to be really important because that's how central these questions are to the faith, and all the stuff is like untangling right now. Now, he's a theologian. He studies history better than I do. That's what he says, so he can justify that. And he's not talking about just about me. He's talking about you too, Fuzz. And I think that makes this really exciting.
Hey, Fuzz, obviously within your model, you don't have the theological questions of people outside the garden because you wouldn't understand them as being human. But the way Josh explains this and says, hey, if we found people on other planets throughout the history of kind of the world, these aren't really new questions. The church has wrestled with these historically speaking. It's just a new way of applying these questions. Do you agree with that? Are you comfortable with that? Or is that another area you might say, I'm not sure I would go there?
I think I'd have to think about that, a little bit more. And as I mentioned earlier, I think, Josh has done an admirable job of highlighting, why he doesn't feel that people outside the garden would necessarily represent a theological issue. And so, I think this is going to be, as Josh is saying, part of the importance of having these conversations and really nailing down, what are actually the theological and biblical parameters that we need to operate within, to remain, faithful to the text and faithful to orthodoxy.
Okay. So there is a parallel problem. Well, I don't even want to say problem. Problem just kind of stigmatizes too much. There's a parallel question that arises in the Reasons to Believe model, and also with Bill Craig, is now they wouldn't necessarily be persons outside the garden, and they wouldn't be people in the image of God, but still there's this question that arises about Neanderthals that aren't in the image of God, possibly interbreeding with humans in the image of God. That raises a lot of questions. Now, I'm not saying that as a deal breaker or as a taunt, to be clear, as some people might have or would. I'm saying that those are really challenging questions too. And I actually think that there's a better way to think about that than calling it bestiality. But that's kind of where I think the tensions are. Okay. I would say that even in the Reasons to Believe model, they're struggling to figure out how to make sense of people outside the garden. They've just identified them differently, and they're raising different sorts of questions with them. And so it ends up actually being somewhat continuous in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Well, we've taken a stab at trying to begin to wrestle through theologically, how do you handle that? And I've actually not seen very many theologians actually engage that question. What if there was interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals, and Neanderthals lack the image of God? How would you handle that theologically? So as far as I know, we're the only ones that are really genuinely wrestling with this, unless I'm just unaware of other people.
Well, Bill is.
Well, okay. Yeah.
I mean, and I am too. I'm trying to help you. So I would say is that, I wouldn't say that I'm going to be trying to promote my model of yours. I want to help you. Like, if there's a way to make theologically sense of that. I mean, one idea that actually, another person who's actually thought about this, Kenneth Kemp, who's Catholic. One idea that's actually come out, which I don't think has been fully followed through with, is this idea that maybe God intended it. And so if God intended it, that means that you have to think about Neanderthals not as human, not as beasts, as some other category. And maybe it was part of how God wanted Adam and Eve's descendants to be able to spread across the earth, was by interbreeding too. And that is something that's really worth exploring. So Kenneth Kemp proposes that might have been why God actually has that. I think the big challenge actually isn't so much about like the ick factor with bestiality. I mean, I think I'm not even sure it's bestiality, but I think the bigger issue is why was it even possible to produce fertile offspring? Because if God was specially creating Adam and Eve, it would have been very easy for him to make that impossible. It's clear that we can imagine a world where humans can have sex with animals and not produce offspring, because that's the world we live in now. Right? And so it's just a little bit bizarre. That's the part where I think there's got to be some thought. Why was that even possible? And I think it's a hint that maybe it wasn't actually bestiality. It wasn't actually something that God disapproved of. That's a place where I would wonder about. I don't know how you feel about that. What do you think?
Well, I mean, you do, and I appreciate your point about bestiality, because in some earlier approaches to that, we were utilizing that concept of bestiality, and as I've thought about it, I think that's probably not helpful. So I very much appreciate that corrective. But I would point out that in Genesis 6, there's some reference that's being made to some type of interbreeding that God doesn't seem to be really pleased with. And so to me, I would say that that's maybe a clue or a hint as to what was happening, though I don't want to go overboard or make too much of that, but that is at least some kind of hint. And to me, I would take the idea that that what we intend sometimes for evil, God can utilize for good. And I'm wondering if that's a way a theological lens to look at the interbreeding issue, is that we intended it for evil, but God could somehow work in the midst of that for good. Although I just was reading a paper published as a preprint in Nature, or like an online version that will be showing up later in print, where this team was looking at like almost 30,000 genomes in Iceland, and they were pointing out they were scanning those genomes for Neanderthal DNA. And what they were walking away from there is saying that Neanderthal contribution, again, is about 2% on average in these genomes. But those places where the Neanderthal DNA is showing up is absolutely inconsequential in large measure.
Neutral DNA. Yeah, I saw that paper too. I made me think of you too.
Yeah. And so to me, that's really interesting, because then what it's saying is that there was this interbreeding that happened, but if it was essentially inconsequential, then whatever of our biology makes us quote unquote human in a biblical sense was not fundamentally impacted by.
Yeah, I think you're fine there. The bigger question is, why was interbreeding possible? I mean, so first of all, we don't see any 50% humans, 50% Neanderthals now, but that meant that existed in the past. And with your minds, I mean, like, how is that even possible? Now, I mean, and especially because you take a view of de novo creation, I think that's kind of a bit of a puzzle. Like, why didn't God make that impossible? But that's okay. We'll think through that. I think the way how I see it all is that when the part that I agree with Fuzz on is that the central question ends up becoming, how do we think about interbreeding with Adam's lineage and others? That's really ends up becoming the central theological question, because everyone's going to be a little bit pressed on that. Even Bill Craig, his questions are going to be a lot reduced, but it'll still be there in the background as a possibility. So everyone has to think through that question of what the relationship between Adam and Eve's lineage is and everyone else outside. And I think there's going to be a variety of solutions. The one that makes the most sense to me, just because I haven't yet seen. So you have to remember, I was raised a young Earth creationist. In a lot of ways, I'm still a young Earth creationist. I mean, for me, I really start with the tradition of Scripture. That's the tradition that's the most important to me, and I just can't build strong scriptural basis for tying the image of God uniquely to Adam and Eve. I can see basis for tying the original sin and the fall to Adam and Eve, but I can't build that airtight case to tying the image of God. I can see a lot of stuff saying that, yeah, maybe there was people in the image of God outside. And so from that point of view, from a scriptural point of view, from the way how I read it, not to say you're not scriptural, I mean, I like a lot of the philosophical considerations, for example, that Bill Craig brings to the table. Well, I respect them. I don't know if I share them as much. I just don't know if I'm really bound to them in the same way as I'm bound to Scripture.
Well, let me jump in and start to bring this conversation a little bit to a close. I think I have to make an observation.
Fun,
I know it is, but I also have to point out to our viewers that I think you're right. When people look back in a few years, they're going to realize that we are thinking through the science and theology and trying to come up with models right now on questions that the church has dealt with broadly, but not particularly in terms of the information that we have. And throughout the history of the church, people were doing this with the doctrine of the Trinity, doing this with how can Jesus be God and man. This is a part of the rich tradition of Christianity, to think deeply and hard and push where it's uncomfortable, but bring it back to Scripture and say what's really true and what comes out of this. And I think the two of you, I thank God that both of you are part of this conversation, because I know both of you are committed to Scripture, even though you interpret it differently, committed to doing good science, but also committed to charity with one another and ultimately to the gospel. I love in the back of your book, Josh, you have a section on the resurrection. I think that
you helped
awesome.
Me with that too, Sean. I really appreciate that.
Oh, I'm happy to. That was a small thing I could look it through and give some suggestions, because I teach a class at Biola in our apologetics program on the resurrection. And when you said you wanted a final chapter just on the case for the resurrection as a scientist, that's one of the reasons I thought, you know what, I want to endorse this book. You are taking a risk as a scientist to say, I think this is true, and I stand behind it. And I know Reasons to Believe does the same thing. I've spoken at many of your conferences. You guys do great science, but you have a heart for evangelism and for the church and for the lost. So I'd commend your books to all of our viewers. Your book, Who Was Adam, your 2015 update, and I assume with all the changes, you guys are working on another update. Can I assume that's coming, Fuzz, in due time?
Oh, yeah, it probably has to.
Eventually. Okay. Well, we'll look for it. But your 2015 one is just, it's an excellent book, scientifically and theologically. And Josh, we'll look forward to the book that you're doing with William Lane Craig. So to our viewers, we want to thank you for viewing in. I also want to invite you, if you enjoyed this conversation at Biola, we have a master's degree in science